This is Left Voices for Wednesday, February 19th, 2014. I'm Andrea Sears. Tonight,
if he is encountered, then he is to be stopped and questioned. And that's burdening his free speech activities, his First Amendment activities, targeting him because of his beliefs.
A peaceful protest draws continuing scrutiny from law enforcement. On February 15, 2011, Army veteran and former CIA analyst Ray McGovern was arrested for standing in silent protest during a speech by then-Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at George Washington University. Though more than 70 years old, he was forcibly grabbed, dragged out of the auditorium, then taken bruised and bleeding to jail. All charges were dropped, but the State Department used the incident as a reason to issue a Be on the Lookout, or BOLO, advisory based solely on his political activism. 3 years later, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on McGovern's behalf against current Secretary of State John Kerry and security officers at George Washington University. Mara Verhayden-Hilliard, executive director of PCJF, says the arrest itself was violent and ironic, considering the topic of Clinton's speech.
She was actually admonishing governments of other countries that they should not suppress dissent. Ray was standing up with his back turned silently, expressing completely peaceful, silent dissent during her speech when he was brutally grabbed, assaulted, arrested by officers at the university. And thereafter we learned that the State Department had put Mr. McGovern on a Be on the Lookout alert, which is more than a lookout alert. It actually was a directive to law enforcement that Mr. McGovern should be stopped on site and questioned. And it was completely based on lawful political activity. So we have filed a federal lawsuit to remedy and seek justice for the arrest, but also to get an injunction about that directive, to have that directive rescinded.
What kind of authority does the State Department have to issue directives to law enforcement?
The State Department has its own law enforcement arm, actually. And it is that law enforcement arm, the Diplomatic Security Center, that both conducted an interrogation of Ray at the site, asking about his political beliefs and associations, and then issued this BOLO alert directive. And as we learned recently, they opened an investigation into him that's completely focused on his political, lawful activities, political activities, freedom of speech activities, his associations with peace groups, as well as his media interviews and his writings about U.S. government war policy.
And in fact, his political activities and anti-war stance are specifically mentioned in this BOLO. There is no hint of criminal activity at all.
That's correct, and in fact, in the documents that we have, they ascertained immediately that he had no criminal record, that there was no criminal activity. So this is a directive for Fourth Amendment seizure, for law enforcement to stop someone, to seize them, to question them, and to do so based completely on free speech activities, not because they have any suspicion that he is engaging in criminal activity. It's a complete violation of his Fourth Amendment rights and his First Amendment rights. And Mr. McGovern, people who know him know that he hardly looks like a threatening person. He was 71 years old at the time. He's now 74. The BOLO says that it identifies specifically his, quote, considerable amount of political activism, primarily anti-war, unquote, and then tells law enforcement that if they encounter Mr. McGovern, they should, quote, use caution, it's all in caps, and stop him and question him.
How did this BOLO come to light?
Well, after his arrest, they charged him for disorderly conduct for standing silently with his back turned. We then worked with criminal defense representatives, and the charges against him were dropped. But subsequently, we began trying to get documents out of the State Department related to his arrest, And that's how we found the BOLO, which was through Freedom of Information Act work. And ultimately, and more recently, we were able to get that out of them.
Certainly, Ray McGovern has remained active since this 2011 incident when he was briefly held. Has this BOLO interfered, to his knowledge or to your knowledge, in his activities? Has it been invoked or used to detain him, to question him since it was issued?
We are not aware of his being seized on the basis of this BOLO, but it would also obviously depend on whether or not in the future he encounters someone who is paying attention to it, aware of it, or the circumstances of where he is. If he, for example, wanted to view or speak out in the context of other State Department events, this is a threat to his ability to do so.
But it doesn't rise to the level of a no-fly list.
It's not that he's been placed on a no-fly list. It is, in fact, that he is placed on a be on the lookout, use caution, stop and question, and it's related to the Department of State issuing this. It is not, to our knowledge, been combined at this point with a different type of watch list like a TSA watch list. However, we also know, because of the fluidity of intelligence gathering, intelligence collection, and the fact that the government is targeting people based on lawful activity regardless of a suspicion of criminal activity, that it's a very dangerous situation for someone to be placed into. And we have the right, as people in the United States, to express dissent against the government and government policies without this kind of targeting operation going against us.
I know that Ray traveled to Russia last year to present an award to Edward Snowden along with other whistleblowers. He had no problems traveling because of this?
Not to our knowledge. We're not aware of his being stopped or seized in the context of his travels.
Are you aware of similar actions taken by the State Department or any other government agency based on First Amendment activities?
Well, we don't have anything specifically like this, although we know, for example, that people have been put on watch lists, that they have been put on TSA lists, that people who've engaged in political activity have certainly been placed in government files, and certainly we have seen information from our own Freedom of Information Act work showing that, for example, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security had no hesitation surveilling, disrupting the Occupy movement, even though they acknowledged it was a completely peaceful movement. So it is not, unfortunately, anomalous for the U.S. government to be using its so-called criminal authority or national security authority or anti-terrorism authority against people, movements, groups based on lawful and peaceful political activity.
What are you hoping to get from this lawsuit? What's the remedy that you're seeking here?
Well, with regard to the BOLO, we want it rescinded. We're seeking an injunction. We have sued the State Department, trying to get an injunction to have his records expunged, to have the State Department lift this BOLO. As far as we can see, it's a standing directive that if he is encountered, then he is to be stopped and questioned. And that's burdening his free speech activities, his First Amendment activities, targeting him because of his beliefs, because he, as a person of conscience, has challenged the U.S. government's representations, leading the government into war against the people of Iraq, for example. He has challenged government representatives' policies in the Middle East, and he is entitled to speak out and speak his mind without threat of law enforcement seizure.
Mara Verhayden-Hilliard is Executive Director of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. This has been Left Voices for Wednesday, February 19th, 2014. Join us again tomorrow for more news and information from a progressive perspective. I'm Andrea Sears for leftvoices.net.